Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. Important ideas here. I want to draw you a little picture here. And this picture is going to help us determine what kind of conclusion are we making when we have the end of a hypothesis test. So we go through everything. We lay out our hypotheses. We lay out our alpha level. We check our conditions. We do our state, plan, do, conclude. So we lay out the plan, we do the math, we conclude, and we decide based on our p-value, whatever we're going to decide. At the end, we then have these situations where we are making a conclusion. And it's going to fall into one of four categories. So I will draw a box like this. And it's one of these four things. So the first thing that could happen is we have to determine what the truth is. So the conclusions are either reject H sub 0 or fail to reject H sub 0. So those are our two conclusions. Either this happens, reject H sub 0, or we fail to reject H sub 0. Well, that is separate from the truth. So what I mean is there's a possibility that we get the right answer and make the wrong conclusion. There's a possibility that we get the wrong conclusion and make the right answer. So the truth is either H sub 0 is true or H sub A is true. So those are the only two things that happen. So either H sub A is true or H sub 0 is true. Well, if our null hypothesis is true and we reject the null, so it's true, but we reject it, that's what's called a type 1 error. Type 1 error. If we have H sub A is true and we reject the null, this is a good thing. That's what we want. So we find that the truth is that H sub A is true and we reject the null. That's good. If the null is true and we fail to reject it, that is good. So you kind of see the pattern here, right? And at the bottom, what we have is the alternative is true, but we fail to reject the null. That would be known as a type 2 error. Okay, so then let's put some words with this. So type 1 error. So type 1 error is H sub 0 is true, but we reject H sub 0. Okay? And the probability of a type 1 error is equal to our alpha level, right? Because alpha level determines whether we reject or fail to reject. Something like this. The null is true, but we find convincing evidence for H sub A. Okay? A type 2 error would be H sub A is true and we fail to reject H sub 0. So the way that this would happen would be the alternative hypothesis is true, but we don't find convincing evidence for it. So the null is, or the alternative is true, but we fail to find convincing evidence for it. Let's look at this in practice. Mr. Wilcox purchased a trick coin that is supposed to land heads up 75% of the time. One of his students volunteered to test this claim. The student flips the coin 50 times and finds that the coin lands heads up 35 times. The student then performs a test of the following hypothesis at the alpha level equals 10%. We've talked about this a little bit, that you can change that alpha level. It's not always 5 or 0.05. Or sorry, yes, 0.05 at the 0.10 significance level. So our null hypothesis is that P is 75. So that would mean that the coin works as advertised. Right? So the null hypothesis is supposed to land heads up 75% of the time. So the coin works as advertised means that our null hypothesis is that the probability of it landing heads up is 75. Our alternative hypothesis is that the coin does not work as advertised. Okay? And we have to have this definition here. So they did this for us. Normally, we might have to do this in a problem on the AP test, but P is the true proportion of tosses of this coin that would land heads up. So H sub 0 is 75% of the tosses land heads up. Alternative is that it's less than 75% lands heads up. So let's describe a type 1 error. So a type 1 error would be where the null is true, but we reject the null. So for a type 1, what would that mean in this context? Well, it would mean the coin works as advertised. But, so that's as advertised, where P is equal to 0.75. But the student finds convincing evidence that it doesn't. Okay? So that would mean that P is less than 0.75. Okay, that would be the convincing evidence. A type 2 error would be the opposite, right? So it would be that the coin does not actually work as advertised. Meaning that the true proportion actually is less than 75. But the student does not find convincing evidence that the coin is not working. Okay? So it's actually not working, but they don't find convincing evidence that it isn't working. So which type of error may result in Mr. Wilcox returning the coin and writing a negative review of the product? So which one is the one where he's going, oh man, this doesn't work. I'm going to write this, bad review. Well, take a look at the nature of these errors. So in type 2, what's the end result? So the coin actually doesn't work, but the student does not find convincing evidence that the coin is not working. So at the end of the type 2 error, they don't say, hey, it's not working. Okay? The coin actually doesn't work, but they don't say that it doesn't work, meaning they'd say that it is working. In this case, Mr. Wilcox ends up writing a bad review, meaning it works, but it's thought to not work. Does that make sense? So it works, but it's thought to not work. So this would actually be a type 1 error here, because Mr. Wilcox returns the coin even though it actually works. So in the type 2 error, the coin doesn't work, but he doesn't think that it doesn't work, meaning the coin, we don't find evidence that it's not working. But in this type 1 error up here, we found convincing evidence that it doesn't. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means we found convincing evidence that it didn't work. That's where the error comes. So if the student were to use alpha equals 0.05 instead of 1, 0, would this make more or less likely to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true? So we reject h sub 0 when h sub 0 is true. That's what a type 1 error is. So type 1 error is when we reject h sub 0 when h sub 0 is true. So if we reduce alpha, it makes a type 1 error less likely. Let me put it to you like this. Let's say we've got, our number line of responses here, and here's our 10%, right? So anything on this side of the line in this lower percent it rejects. Well, if I take my alpha level and I move it down this way and I put it at 5%, now there's less answers that will get rejected. And if the type 1 error is rejecting it when it's actually true, then lowering my alpha level gives me less likelihood that there's this, it makes it less likely that there's this pool that they reject from, okay? All right, so that's the basics of type 1 and type 2 errors, guys. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.